What if a simple act of kindness, like paying for a stranger's tea, could change the fate of an entire town? What if a weary veteran and his loyal dog uncovered a hidden truth that brought life back to a dying orchard? And what if the miracle this land needed was not power or wealth, but the quiet courage of ordinary people who refused to give up? Enjoy the story. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The night air along the highway carried a thin chill that drifted through neon lights and the smell of burnt coffee. A low blanket of clouds hid the stars, and the soft hum of trucks passing in the distance gave the world a tired rhythm. Inside, the small diner that stayed open through the darkest hours. Warm yellow bulbs cast a gentle glow over the counter and booths, filling the room with a sense of quiet survival. Luke Miller pushed open the glass door with a slow, steady movement. He was a man shaped by long years of war and longer years of trying to rebuild himself. At 40, his body held the memory of every desert march he had taken in Afghanistan. His shoulders were broad and strong, but carried a heaviness earned from too many losses. His face was angular, with a square jaw shadowed by rough stubble. His brown hair was cut short and flecked with early silver near the temples. His eyes were a muted gray blue, and often drifted with a distant watchfulness, as if he still listened for sounds no one else could hear. The war had taken pieces of him, and while it had ended for the world, it lived quietly in him every day. Following at his heel was Max, his loyal dog. Max was a mixed breed with German Shepherd blood, clear in the sharp angles of his face and the power in his stance. His coat was a deep brown, touched with strands of black along his back and tail. His ears stood tall and alert, as if tuned to a frequency that humans could not sense. Max was 5 years old, still strong and quick, and he carried in his amber eyes a calm intelligence that blended with a deep instinct for protection. Luke had adopted Max from a rescue shelter after returning home. Since then, the dog had become a constant presence, steady in a world that often felt unstable. Luke took a seat at the counter, still wearing his faded work jacket and scuffed boots from a long shift at the small electrical company that paid just enough to cover bills and chip slowly at old debts. His hands were rough and calloused from handling tools all day. Despite the fatigue etched into his posture, there was a quiet kindness in the way he carried himself. He did not speak much, but always noticed people on the edge of exhaustion or loneliness, perhaps because he knew the feeling too well. Max settled beside him, but the dog did not relax the way he usually did. Instead, he sat tall with his ears flicking toward the large windows that overlooked the dim parking lot. His tail lay still against the floor. His gaze was fixed beyond the glass, as though he sensed something moving in the shadows. Luke glanced down and saw the tension building through Mac's shoulders. The dog rarely behaved like this without a reason. At the far end of the counter sat an older man finishing a simple plate of eggs and toast. The man looked to be in his late 60s. His frame was thin from long hours on the road, but still carried hints of the strength he once had. His face was lined with deep creases, and his white beard was trimmed close to his jaw. His hands were weathered and stained with engine grease. His denim jacket hung loose on his shoulders, and his eyes, though tired, held a warm spark that suggested decades of stories collected from highways across the country. The man reached into his pocket to pay, then paused. His brow furrowed with sudden worry as he patted his jacket again, searching each pocket with growing frustration. Luke recognized the expression. It was the same look he had worn many times while deployed when he realized something essential had gone missing at the worst possible moment. The old man sighed and looked at the waitress with an apologetic tilt of his head. His voice was low and hoarse from years of engine noise. He spoke softly, so as not to disturb the few night workers resting in the booths. Before the waitress could respond, Luke rose from his seat. He pulled a few wrinkled bills from his jacket pocket and placed them gently on the counter. His movement was simple, unannounced, almost invisible in its modesty. He nodded once to the waitress, then returned to his seat as though nothing had happened. The old man blinked with surprise. He turned his head toward Luke, with gratitude softening the weariness in his eyes. Luke offered a small nod, the kind that asked for nothing in return. For Luke, the gesture meant little more than a passing moment of decency, a small act that reminded him he still had the ability to help, even in tiny ways. After years of being trained to act under pressure, his instinct to step forward had never faded. But now, instead of danger, he responded to small human needs. It grounded him. It gave him purpose beyond survival. Max, however, still was not at ease. The dog turned his head sharply toward the door as a gust of cold air hissed under the frame. His ears stood rigid. His muscles tightened. His breath grew shallow in a slow pattern that told Luke he sensed something more than a passerby or an idling truck. Luke followed Mac's gaze and looked through the glass. The parking lot lay under dull yellow streetlights. A few semi-trucks rested near the edges. A single dark sedan was parked farther away, its windows reflecting only shadows. Nothing seemed out of place, yet Max stayed locked on the scene with unblinking focus. Luke placed a hand gently on Max's neck. The dog's fur bristled beneath his fingers. He whispered a soft, calming note, but Max remained on alert. Luke trusted Max deeply. The dog had warned him of danger more than once in the past. It was an instinct Luke had learned not to dismiss. Still, he reminded himself that this was just a highway diner. Noise and movement came and went. Tension did not always mean threat. The waitress brought Luke a cup of black coffee. Her name was Mary, a middle-aged woman with short red hair and a worn blue apron. She had a tired smile from working night shifts for years, but a gentle manner with customers who sat alone. Luke nodded his thanks. Mary had seen enough long nights to recognize when a man looked like he was carrying the weight of things he did not say. The old man finished the last of his toast and approached Luke on his way out. He gave a warm smile and tapped the counter lightly with his knuckles. His voice carried a hint of relief. Luke did not reply with words. He simply lifted his chin in quiet acknowledgement. The old man tucked his hat beneath his arm and walked toward the door. As it opened, a cold gust swept in. Max growled under his breath. A soft growl, but clear. Luke felt his body tense out of habit. The old man stepped into the parking lot. The door closed behind him. Luke listened to the fading footsteps on the pavement. A moment later, Max turned his gaze sharply again toward the far corner of the lot. His pulse quickened. His tail stiffened. His entire posture shifted from alert to wary. Luke watched silently. A long-buried instinct awakened within him. The ability to read danger without seeing it. The subtle shift in the air. The tightness in the gut. But nothing moved in the darkness. Only the steady hum of truck engines and the glow of streetlights. Luke leaned back on his stool, forcing his breath to settle. This was supposed to be a quiet night, a simple stop for coffee before heading home to his small rented room and the ongoing pile of bills he could barely manage. He reminded himself that not every shadow hid a threat. Yet Max kept staring. The dog did not blink. Luke felt a slow heaviness settle in his chest. He could not explain it, but something about the dog's behavior felt like the first tremor of a story he had not yet been asked to live. For now, though, he let it go. He finished his coffee. He paid the bill. He gathered his jacket and called Max to follow. As they stepped out into the cold night, Max paused at the doorway and looked once more at the silent parking lot. A quiet warning lived in his amber eyes. Not fear, not aggression, something more subtle. Something that said he had heard a sound too soft for human ears. Luke stood still for a moment, letting the chill settle across his skin. He chose not to turn back for a second look. Instead, he placed his hand on Max's neck and began the walk toward home. Behind them, the diner lights glowed softly through the windows, but Max did not look away until the building was far behind. A soft gray morning settled over Orchard Creek as thin clouds filtered the sun into a pale wash of light. The air held a faint coldness from the night before, and the wind drifted gently across fields that stretched beyond the small roads leading out of town. It was the kind of morning that felt suspended between seasons, quiet yet expectant. Luke Miller stepped out of his small rented place with Max walking closely beside him. Luke still carried the weight of the long night at the diner in his bones. He had slept uneasily, troubled by Max's strange tension. Even in the morning light, the memory of Max staring into the dark parking lot stayed with him like a question that refused to fade. As Luke locked the door, a familiar truck rumbled to a stop near the curb. The old pickup was pale blue with peeling paint along the sides. Behind the wheel sat the older man from the diner. The man lifted a hand in greeting and stepped out slowly. His name was Walter Green. He introduced himself with a humble tone that fit the lines of age carved into his face. Walter was in his late 60s with a slender build that suggested years spent working outdoors. His beard was white and trimmed close. His eyes were a deep hazel soft with kindness, but shadowed by a hint of regret. His denim jacket was worn thin at the elbows, and his boots were coated in dust. Everything about him spoke of a man who had lived through cycles of gain and loss and was still holding on to something he refused to let disappear. Luke nodded politely. He had not expected to see the man again. Walter cleared his throat before speaking, as if unsure whether he had the right to ask anything at all. He thanked Luke again for helping him at the diner and said he would like to return the gesture in some small way. He invited Luke to visit an old apple storage barn he owned on the outskirts of Orchard Creek. He spoke of it modestly, as if it were nothing special, but his voice trembled faintly as he mentioned the place. Luke hesitated. He did not often accept invitations from strangers. His life after deployment had been built on routine and caution. But something in Walter's demeanor reminded him of the many elders he had met overseas who offered quiet hospitality in harsh landscapes. There was sincerity in the old man's voice. And Max, who usually kept a careful distance, walked toward Walter with a slow, curious step. Luke noticed the way Max's tail lowered, but did not tuck a sign of cautious acceptance rather than fear. That was enough for Luke. He agreed to go. They climbed into the truck. Max sat in the back seat, his alert gaze drifting from the open road to the old man in the front. As the truck wound through the narrow streets and then onto the rural road leading toward Orchard Creek, Luke studied the landscape. He had lived nearby for years, but rarely traveled this far beyond town. Rolling stretches of dry grass lined the road, and abandoned fences marked shrinking boundaries of farms long past their prime. Walter spoke little during the drive. When he did speak, his voice carried a heavy nostalgia. He mentioned how the area had once been known for its orchards and how his family had tended apple trees for generations. Luke listened without interrupting, sensing that the old man spoke to keep something alive within him. They arrived at a small clearing where the grass grew wild. At the far end stood an old barn that had once been painted red, but now had faded to a muted brown. The roof sagged slightly, and the boards along the side were warped from years of weather. The place felt abandoned, yet not forgotten. Luke stepped out and breathed in. The air carried the faint scent of apples, not fresh ones, but the sour ghost of fruit long crushed into the wood. It was the smell of time itself, lingering stubbornly. Walter walked toward the barn with slow, deliberate steps. He placed his hand on the old wooden door, as if greeting an old friend weakened by age. He pushed the door open, and a wave of musty air drifted out. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the walls, casting thin beams across dust particles hanging in the stillness. Inside the barn, Luke saw an old apple press made of cast iron and aged timber. It stood like a relic of better years, but was layered with rust. Wooden crates were scattered around some broken others, left untouched for decades. Cobwebs stretched between beams like threads of forgotten stories. Luke felt a strange tug in his chest. The barn reminded him of places he had lived in briefly, while deployed houses abandoned by families who had fled war. It carried the same quiet ache of lives interrupted. Walter stood beside him, with a faint smile, one that held more sorrow than pride. He said this barn had once been the heart of his family's orchard. They had pressed gallons of apple cider and apple syrup here during harvest season. People used to come from miles around. His voice drifted away as though speaking the memory aloud hurt more than silence. Luke sensed the old man's grief. He recognized the weight of something cherished slipping beyond reach. Max began exploring the barn, sniffing carefully along the floorboards. His tail swayed slightly, but his ears remained alert. Luke kept a watchful eye on him. Walter motioned toward the apple press. He explained how it used to work, and how the sound of apples being crushed had once meant hope for winter. Then he grew quiet, his shoulders dropping as though the memories were heavier than he expected. Max suddenly tugged on his leash, hard enough to pull Luke a step forward. The dog's muscles tightened, and he lowered his body slightly, as if tracking a scent. Luke followed Max's gaze toward the corner near the apple press. The dog sniffed intensely, circling the machine and pushing his nose along the wooden floor. Then Max stopped. He stood completely still, his paws braced against one particular plank. The plank was darker than the others, and when Max pressed his weight onto it, a hollow sound echoed through the barn. Luke knelt and tapped the wood. The same empty thump trembled beneath his fingertips. Walter frowned deeply. His expression shifted from curiosity to unease. Luke glanced up and saw an old fear flicker in the man's eyes, though Walter tried to hide it. The barn grew silent. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. Max stayed fixed on the plank, his amber eyes sharp and unblinking. Luke could sense his dog's certainty. Something was hidden beneath that wooden board, something long kept silent. Luke looked from Max to Walter, quietly waiting for an explanation. But the old man stared at the hollow plank with a rigid tightness in his jaw. The moment stretched until Walter finally exhaled as though releasing years of tension. He whispered that he had not stepped inside this barn for a long time and that some things felt better left alone. Yet even as he said the words, his voice trembled. Luke did not lift the plank. Not yet. He simply rested his hand on Max's head, calming the dog, though Max kept staring at the floor with unwavering focus. For Luke, the discovery stirred a quiet unease. He felt the familiar sensation of standing at the edge of something unresolved, like a mission briefing where too many details were missing. He sensed that whatever lay beneath that plank would change more than the old man's day. It might change something in himself too. But this chapter of the story could go no further. The barn stood heavy with silence. The air remained thick with the sour memory of apples, and Max remained the first to hear a truth still hidden from both men. Night settled over Orchard Creek with a stillness that softened every sound. A thin layer of mist drifted between the trees, and the old barn stood like a worn silhouette against the dim sky. The air was cool, with the faint scent of dried grass and distant wood smoke. A single lantern hung by the barn door, casting a small pool of warm light into the spreading darkness. Luke Miller returned to the property, with Max walking close at his side. He had spent the day working on electrical repairs around town, yet his mind kept drifting back to the hollow plank beneath the apple press. Something about it had stirred an unease he could not explain. It had awakened a feeling like knowing a door was cracking open somewhere deep inside a long abandoned place. Max had sensed it too. The dog moved with alert purpose, his ears turning toward every rustle of the evening wind. Walter Green waited near the barn entrance. The old man wore the same denim jacket from earlier, but now his shoulders were slumped lower, as if weighed down by memories he wished he could leave behind. In the lantern glow, his lined face appeared even more fragile. His hazel eyes carried resignation, and fear mixed into one unsteady expression. He greeted Luke softly. His voice held hesitation. Luke could tell the old man had thought long and hard about whether he truly wanted to open the barn again. Walter gripped the lantern tightly, as though its small glow was the only thing that steadied him. Luke studied him quietly, noticing the way Walter's hands trembled. This was not simply worry. It was the trembling of a man who had carried guilt for far too long. They stepped inside. The barn felt colder at night. Dust hovered in the air and shadows clung to the corners. The apple press stood silent and lifeless. The sour scent of old apples seemed stronger, as if the darkness brought forgotten things closer to the surface. Max moved first. The dog padded forward with quick steps, then slowed as he approached the hollow plank. His nose lowered to the wood. His body tensed with certainty. Luke knelt beside him and placed his hand on the plank. The same hollow sound echoed faintly beneath his touch. Walter stopped several feet away. His posture stiffened. He did not move closer. Instead, he stared at the floor with an expression Luke had seen before in soldiers who returned from war, carrying truths they wished had never happened. Luke pried the plank up carefully. It lifted with surprising ease, revealing a small wooden opening beneath. Cool air drifted upward, carrying the scent of earth and metal. Beneath the opening was a narrow stairway, leading down into a hidden chamber. The dim lantern light revealed rusted metal pipes running through the walls and disappearing into the ground. Luke looked up at Walter, waiting for an explanation. The old man closed his eyes briefly, as though steadying himself. His face tightened. When he opened his eyes again, they glistened, not with sadness alone, but with years of a buried regret. He stepped closer until he could see the opening clearly. His breath hitched as though he were looking at a grave. His voice came out low and uneven. He said the chamber below had once been part of the original water system that fed his family orchard. It carried water from the underground spring through the orchard, supplying every tree with steady nourishment. For generations, it had given life to the land. Luke could hear the bitterness in the old man's voice. Walter continued speaking slowly, as if each word was a weight he had to lift. He said that many years ago, a large beverage company approached his family, promising to modernize the orchard system and help them increase production. The company representatives spoke with confidence and charm. They promised partnership, but the contract placed the family at a disadvantage. Walter had believed them because he had wanted to keep the orchard alive for his children and grandchildren. As he spoke, he turned away, as though unable to meet Luke's eyes. He said that after signing the contract, the company secretly rerouted part of the spring water to their own facilities outside the town. The orchard slowly weakened. The trees dried little by little. Each season came with less fruit and more dead branches. Luke listened in silence. He could feel the pain wrapped inside every sentence. Walter said he had discovered the truth too late. When he confronted the company, they blamed weather and soil quality. They denied everything. They said farmers came and went while business stayed firm. Walter had no proof to fight them. His voice cracked slightly as he admitted he had locked the chamber and nailed the plank down. He could not bear to face what he felt responsible for. He believed the orchard had died because he had allowed strangers onto his land and into the heart of the water system his family had built. He carried guilt like a second skin. Luke felt a slow ache inside him. He knew the weight of mistakes, real or imagined. He had seen men break under guilt far lighter than this. He spoke gently, telling Walter the orchard's death was not his fault. Walter shook his head, refusing comfort. His shoulders curled inward as though he wanted to make himself smaller to escape the truth. Max whined softly and nudged the old man's leg with his nose. Walter looked down at the dog, startled. The gentle touch of the animal made something inside him soften. His posture loosened slightly, but his eyes remained clouded with sorrow. He whispered that sometimes he wished he had never signed the contract, that if he had been stronger or more cautious, the orchard might still live. Luke placed the lantern near the opening. He leaned down and examined the pipes. They were rusted now, but he could imagine how they once carried clear, cold water through the orchard. He could almost hear the gentle rush of it, feeding the roots of countless apple trees. He pictured the land alive, green, and full of promise. Walter watched him closely. Luke asked how long it had been since the chamber had been opened. Walter replied quietly that it had been many years. He said he had avoided the barn entirely because being near it made him feel as though the trees were judging him for their loss. Luke stood slowly absorbing the old man's confession. He understood now why Walter had invited him. Luke sensed Walter was not simply showing him a place. He was telling someone the truth for the first time in years. It was the kind of truth that became a burden if left unspoken. The air inside the barn felt thick. The sound of the wind outside slipped through the cracks with a soft sigh. Walter leaned heavily against the apple press. His face looked older than before, worn by regret that had dug deep lines into his features. He whispered that after locking the chamber, he had let the orchard die because he believed he had no right to try saving it. Luke felt a mixture of sadness and quiet anger, not at Walter, but at the injustice of someone being made to carry blame for something he did not cause. He understood too well how guilt could twist itself into truth inside a person's mind. Max remained by the opening, his body still tense, but his gaze calm, as though waiting for what came next. Luke placed the plank back over the hole, though he did not seal it. The chamber was no longer hidden. It would no longer sit in silence beneath the floor. Walter watched, with a mixture of fear and relief. Luke did not push further. The night was not meant for decisions. It was meant for truths, long buried to finally surface. Walter closed the lantern and stepped back toward the barn door. His steps were slow, but no longer weighed down by secrecy. Luke followed him out, Max walking between them with a steady, quiet stride. Behind them, the barn stood dark once more. But something had changed. The secret beneath the floor was no longer locked away. It had been acknowledged, and that alone had shifted the air around them. For now, that was enough. Rain swept across Orchard Creek in violent sheets as night pressed down over the land. The storm clouds hung low and heavy, pulsing with distant thunder. Wind tore through the empty orchard, rattling brittle branches and carrying the scent of wet earth across the dark property. The old barn and the farmhouse stood in the gloom, like silhouettes bracing themselves against the force of the storm. Luke Miller woke with a start when Max began pacing beside his bed. The dog whined sharply, his body tense, his ears pricked toward the window. Luke was exhausted from the long day, but the familiar warning in Max's behavior forced him fully awake. Max never reacted like this unless something was wrong. The dog whined again, a deep, urgent note, then barked once toward the door. Luke sat up quickly and grabbed his jacket. His muscles responded out of trained instinct. Years as a combat engineer had shaped him to react before thinking when danger whispered at the edges of night. He slipped on his boots and opened the door. Max bolted out into the narrow hallway, then toward the back exit of the farmhouse. Rain hammered the roof in deafening waves. Outside the yard was almost completely swallowed by darkness. The lantern Luke carried flickered wildly as wind whipped against it. Max tore through the mud toward the orchard, his paws splashing through growing puddles. Luke followed, trying to shield his face from the cold rain that stung his skin. The orchard looked ghostly in the storm. Rows of apple trees stood like skeletal figures, their branches shivering beneath the wind. Max darted ahead, weaving between the trees as though following a scent only he could sense. His tail stood stiff. His posture radiated urgency. Luke pushed through the storm until Max finally stopped near a shallow trench that cut across the ground. The dog barked at the earth below and began scratching frantically at the mud. Luke knelt beside him. Lightning cracked across the sky for a moment, illuminating the ground in stark white. That brief flash revealed the break. The underground pipe that once carried the orchard's water had been sliced clean through. Not broken from age, not cracked by weather, but severed deliberately. The cut edges were smooth, gleaming faintly under the lantern light. Rainwater streamed into the open gap, mixing with mud and burying the truth. But Luke had already seen enough. His breath tightened. He lifted the pipe, carefully running his fingers along the edge. The line had been cut with precision. A clean cut, like the mark of a sharp industrial tool. Not the kind of damage caused by accident or weather. Max growled, low pacing in tight circles around the trench. His fur bristled along his spine. Luke scanned the ground despite the storm. There were footprints half washed away and scattered clumps of mud tinted with faint traces of a darker red clay. Clinging to one clump was a fragment of soft fiber. Luke picked it up. It bore a faded design that still showed beneath the grime. It was the logo of the same beverage company that had betrayed Walter's family years ago. Luke felt something shift inside him. A sense of clarity sharpened by anger. He had spent years building and repairing systems that kept soldiers alive. He knew sabotage when he saw it. This was not vandalism. This was strategy. Someone had returned to finish what they had started. Walter stumbled toward them through the storm, his lantern swinging wildly in his trembling hand. His voice cracked through the rain, calling Luke's name. He reached the trench, nearly slipping as he struggled to balance himself. His eyes widened when he saw the severed pipe. For a long moment, he simply stared. The rain soaked his denim jacket, plastering it against his thin frame. Water dripped from his white beard and ran down the deep creases of his face. Then his legs seemed to give out. He fell to his knees in the mud beside the broken pipe. Luke reached to steady him, but Walter brushed his hand away. His chest heaved with grief and disbelief. His voice came out as a broken whisper. "It is over." He repeated the words like someone accepting a final loss. Years of guilt now crashed together with the fresh shock of betrayal. He believed the cut pipe was the end, the last blow to land on a life already battered by regret. Luke felt a rising anger toward whoever had done this. The cold, determined kind of anger he had known on battlefields, the kind that sharpened thought rather than clouding it. He crouched beside the pipe and examined the soil. Even in the storm, he could see evidence of deliberate intrusion. Walter covered his face with his hands. His voice trembled. He said the orchard had been dying for years, and now even the hope of restoring the water was gone. The storm raged around him, but the defeat in his voice cut deeper than the wind. He said he should have known they would return, that people who saw land and water only as numbers never truly left things alone. The storm made his words nearly drown in the noise, but Luke heard every one. Luke placed a steady hand on the old man's shoulder. His voice was firm but calm. He told Walter the cut was too precise to be a random act. He explained in simple, clear terms the pattern of the blade marks and the angle of the damage. Whoever had done this had used skill, not luck. They wanted the orchard's water source destroyed completely. Walter lowered his hands slowly. His hazel eyes, wide and shining with despair, met Luke's calm, unbroken gaze. Walter whispered that he did not know how to fight people who were willing to destroy everything just to maintain their power. Luke looked toward the orchard, his jaw set in quiet tension. The truth settled in him with a weight he recognized. He had seen men do terrible things for resources overseas. Now he saw it here in a small, quiet town. Greed was not bound by geography. It traveled with those who valued control over life. Max continued watching the darkness behind them. The dog's stance never relaxed. His instincts told him the threat was still near, even if unseen. Luke trusted Max more than he trusted most people. If Max felt danger lingering, Luke would not dismiss it. Walter stared at the severed pipe. The rain ran over his face, mixing with tears he made no effort to hide. Luke could feel the old man's heart break as though it radiated through the storm. This orchard had been his family's legacy, their heritage, their pride. To see its last lifeline cut so cleanly was like witnessing the final moments of a loved one. Luke knew there was nothing he could say to erase that pain, but he also knew the truth mattered. He spoke softly but firmly, telling Walter this was not the end, but the beginning of a fight. Luke told him that someone had done this with intent, and intent could be proven. He said that the battle was no longer against failing soil or old systems, but against people who underestimated them both. Walter looked at him with a hollow expression, unsure whether to believe. Luke's voice held the steady certainty of a man who had walked through war and learned that giving up was a luxury he could not afford. The storm raged around them, but Luke remained still. His mind calculated possibilities. The broken pipe was evidence. The mud with the company logo was evidence. A pattern was forming. He had seen such patterns before, and he knew they pointed not to failure, but to a target. Walter shivered in the rain. He whispered again that it felt like the end. Luke shook his head slowly. It is not the end, he said. It is the truth showing itself. Max stood between them, the rain dripping down his fur, his amber eyes scanning the orchard with unwavering focus. The dog gave a low rumble, barely audible over the storm. It was not fear. It was recognition. Luke felt the storm swell around him, but inside his chest, something steadier formed. A resolve that came from years of hardship. A promise to himself that he would not stand by while someone destroyed what others loved. He lifted Walter to his feet. Slowly, they walked back toward the barn, Max guiding them through the mud. The severed pipe remained behind in the rain, a silent witness to a cruelty that demanded to be answered. Luke did not look back, but he knew this was the moment he truly saw the kind of enemy they faced. People who saw land not as life, but as profit. People willing to destroy an orchard to claim control. For the first time, he understood the depth of what Walter had endured, and he felt the storm outside match the storm beginning inside him. Morning rose over Orchard Creek, wrapped in a soft, pale haze. The sky remained clouded from the storm the night before, and the air held the damp chill of soaked soil. Light filtered through the thin fog, drifting above the orchard and across the old barn, where shadows still clung to the corners. The world felt quiet, but not calm. It felt like the pause between discovery and consequence. Luke Miller walked across the wet ground with Max trotting beside him. His boots sank into the softened earth, leaving deep prints behind. Sleep had been difficult after finding the severed pipe. The storm had passed, but the tension inside Luke had not. Max also remained alert. The dog moved with careful steps, his ears tilting at every faint sound, as though he expected danger to rise from the silence. Luke approached the barn and pushed the door open. The scent of damp wood and the sour memory of apples greeted him. In the corner, the lifted plank still rested aside, revealing the dark opening to the hidden chamber. Max moved first, his nose lowering to the edge of the hole. Luke followed with a lantern. The light cast a narrow beam down the old ladder and onto the packed earth below. They descended slowly. The chamber felt colder than the night air above. Rusted pipes lined the walls, and old wooden beams creaked softly in the stillness. Max sniffed the ground, then paused, his posture sharp with purpose. He pressed his nose against a seam in the stone wall. Luke knelt and tapped the wall. This section echoed differently, hollow and faint. Luke brushed away dirt with his hands. Beneath the dust lay a thin metal panel, almost invisible against the dark stone. He pried at the edge carefully until it loosened with a muted scrape. Behind it was a narrow cavity sealed with an old cylinder made of tarnished metal. The tube was long and capped at both ends. Luke lifted it gently. It was heavier than it looked and coated in grime. Max wagged his tail once, a slow, deliberate motion that signaled certainty. Luke carried the tube up the ladder and into the barn. Using a cloth, he twisted the cap open. Inside lay a roll of aged paper, tied with a brittle piece of string, along with a small envelope yellowed with time. He unrolled the paper slowly. The pages revealed detailed drawings of the old water system. Lines of ink traced the underground flow, the direction of the pipes, and the original design created by a woman named Ellen Ward, who had been the orchard's engineer decades earlier. Her handwriting was neat and meticulous. Margins were filled with notes describing the pressure of the water in each season and careful observations from her work. Luke read every line carefully. Ellen Ward must have been a precise, thoughtful woman. He imagined her as someone who saw land not just as soil, but as a living structure. Someone who understood water as both lifeblood and responsibility. A quiet respect grew in him for the woman who had created a system meant to protect the orchard's future. Inside the envelope, he found faded documents that appeared to be property and water rights records from years past. The text was smudged with age, but still legible. These papers showed clearly that the orchard held legal claim to the water source before the beverage company arrived. Luke felt his pulse tighten. Evidence. Not just suspicion or memory, but actual proof. Proof that the family had been the rightful owners of the water, and that the company had taken what was not theirs. Even after years of trouble, the truth had endured, hidden beneath wood and stone, waiting for someone to listen. Luke folded the documents carefully and placed them back into the cylinder. He knew he needed guidance to understand them fully. He also knew where to go: the town library. Grace the librarian had lived in Orchard Creek long enough to know its history better than anyone. He remembered her calm presence from previous visits. Grace was in her late 50s, with silver streaks in her dark hair, usually tied into a neat bun. Her face carried fine lines from years of reading and quiet thought. She had a gentle but firm way of speaking, and a sharp mind that paid attention to things other people overlooked. Luke loaded Max into his truck and drove toward town. The road was still wet, and the sky remained gray. As he drove, he felt something shift inside him. He did not yet know what would happen, but he sensed the story of the orchard was changing. Evidence had a way of bringing buried truth back to the surface. The library sat near the center of town, a modest brick building with tall windows and climbing ivy. Luke pushed open the door, and Max followed him in. The air inside smelled of paper and warm lamplight. Grace looked up from the front desk, her wire-framed glasses perched low on her nose. She greeted Luke with calm curiosity. Luke approached the desk and said he needed help understanding some old papers. Grace observed the seriousness in his voice. She stood and motioned him toward a reading table beneath a large window. Her movements were quiet and assured. She carried herself like someone who had spent a lifetime guiding people toward answers. Luke placed the metal cylinder on the table. Grace studied it with raised brows, before opening it carefully. She lifted the blueprint sheets one by one, her eyes narrowing with recognition. She whispered Ellen Ward's name with a soft reverence. Grace explained that Ellen had been a brilliant engineer, known for her devotion to preserving Orchard Creek's natural resources. Grace spoke slowly as she pieced together the memory. Grace said Ellen had fought hard to establish protected water rights for the orchard. But after the company moved in, Ellen's concerns were dismissed and eventually overshadowed. Grace's face darkened with sadness when she said Ellen passed away before she could defend her findings. Luke watched Grace carefully. She handled the papers with the gentleness of someone holding a fragile truth. Grace opened the old envelope containing the rights documents. Her expression sharpened. She recognized the signatures dates and legal stamps. She told Luke that if these documents were authentic and still valid, they showed a clear continuity of ownership. She explained that water rights were often absolute if the original agreements had not been legally dissolved. She said the beverage company could be held accountable if it was proven they intentionally diverted or compromised the water supply. Luke felt a sense of clarity forming. Grace continued. She said that if he could show the company had cut the pipe or altered the system in a deliberate act of sabotage, then the law would return the rights to the rightful landowner. Luke leaned back, slightly taking in her explanation. He felt the heavy frustration and exhaustion from the night before settle into something steadier. Purpose. He finally had direction. Grace watched him with a sympathetic but determined gaze. She said quietly that the orchard had been mistreated for too long. She believed the land deserved someone willing to stand up for it. Her voice carried gentle strength. Luke thanked her with a nod. Max rested at his feet, head on his paws, but his eyes never left Luke's face, as if understanding the weight of what had been uncovered. Grace suggested making copies of the documents and storing them safely. Luke agreed. She moved with deliberate care, taking each piece to the archive room. Luke waited at the table, running his fingers across the blueprint lines. He imagined Ellen drawing them decades ago, imagining the orchard thriving. A feeling of connection crossed his chest. He thought about Walter. The old man had believed he had lost everything. Luke now knew that hope existed, buried in metal and ink. Hope created by someone who saw value in the land long before grief and betrayal took root. When Grace returned, she handed Luke a folder and said he needed to move carefully. She advised him to gather evidence and prepare for a legal challenge. Her calm tone steadied him. Luke walked out of the library with Max at his side. The sky remained gray, but Luke felt something brighter stirring beneath it. He held the folder tightly. For the first time, he felt he had a chance to protect the orchard and help Walter reclaim what had been stolen. Max brushed against his leg as they reached the truck. Luke placed a hand on the dog's back, feeling the solid warmth beneath the fur. Max had led him to the hidden chamber. Max had sensed danger before anyone else. Luke whispered a quiet thank you. He looked toward the horizon where the orchard waited. Something had begun. Something that would not be silenced again. Morning arrived with a thin veil of mist drifting over Orchard Creek. The air felt cool and unsettled, as though the weather itself sensed the tension building in the town. The courthouse sat at the edge of the square, tall and pale against the gray sky, with its wide stone steps still damp from the night dew. Inside the halls, the scent of old varnish, mixed with paper and polished floors. Everything felt stiff, formal, and expectant, as if every wall waited to hear the truth. Luke Miller entered the courthouse with Max walking at his heel. Luke had not slept well. He had spent most of the night reviewing the papers Grace had copied for him and preparing himself for whatever he would face. His body felt heavy but steady. His jaw remained firm, the way it always did when he was about to step into a situation that tested more than his hands. Max walked close, his tail low, but his eyes sharp. The dog sensed the weight of the day and stayed pressed against Luke as they moved through the hallway. Walter was already seated on a wooden bench near the front of the room. His thin frame looked smaller beneath the harsh lights, but his eyes tried to hold steady. Walter wore his old brown jacket and a faded cap that had once belonged to his father. He clasped his hands tightly in his lap, as though holding the last thread of hope. When he saw Luke and Max approach, his shoulders loosened. He whispered a quiet greeting filled with gratitude and fear. Across the room sat the representative of the beverage company. The attorney was a man named Martin Doyle, a clean-cut figure in his 40s with neatly combed blonde hair and a narrow face. His suit fit perfectly, and his expression held a polished confidence. His pale blue eyes scanned the room with the calmness of someone accustomed to controlling every outcome. Martin spoke softly to an assistant as he opened a leather case containing a set of documents and a small sealed jar of water. Luke watched him for a moment. There was something rehearsed about Martin's gestures, something that reminded Luke of officers he had served under who believed strategy mattered more than humanity. Luke felt the old tension rise in his chest, the same tension that once came before a mission when he was unsure if the decisions of others would endanger innocent lives. He placed a calming hand on Max's back. The hearing began when the county commissioner entered. Commissioner Harris was a man in his early 60s, with gray hair trimmed neatly and lines across his face that suggested years of dealing with disputes and difficult decisions. His voice carried authority, but also patience. He sat behind a wide desk and reviewed the documents before him. Commissioner Harris invited both sides to present their evidence. Martin stood, first speaking, with a smooth, practiced tone. He stated that the sample of water he carried would demonstrate that the orchard's water source belonged legally and structurally to the company's system. He lifted the glass jar so the commissioner could see it. The water inside appeared clear, harmless, and ordinary. As Martin set the jar on the table, Max suddenly stiffened. His ears shot upward, and his low growl vibrated through his chest. It was not a defensive growl, but a warning. Luke pressed a hand to Max's neck, but the dog stepped forward slightly, eyes fixed on the jar. Luke had seen this behavior before. Max had served as a working dog during Luke's deployment. The dog had the ability to detect subtle chemical scents that humans could not. Luke felt a cold pinch of concern. Martin continued speaking, describing pressure routes and industrial maintenance. Luke barely listened. His attention remained on Max, whose growl increased softly as though he sensed the jar itself was a threat. Several people in the courtroom turned to look confused by the dog's reaction. Martin frowned and glanced briefly at Max before continuing. When it became Luke's turn, he presented the documents Grace had helped him examine. He spoke calmly, explaining Ellen Ward's blueprint and the water rights that had belonged to the orchard long before the company arrived. Walter remained still, his hands trembling as he listened to Luke speak for him. Midway through the discussion, Martin gestured toward the jar again, intending to use it as a visual reference. His assistant moved the folder beside it, causing the jar to tip. The glass rolled and fell onto the table edge before spilling its contents directly across the polished wood. A sharp chemical smell hit the air. The liquid streaked across the table, and within seconds, the wood began to bleach, turning pale as if stripped of its finish. A few drops sizzled faintly when they touched the metal clasp of the commissioner's notebook, leaving a dull white mark. Gasps filled the room. Max barked once, a loud, decisive sound that echoed against the paneled walls, as though confirming what Luke already feared. Commissioner Harris leaned forward, his brows heavy with concern. He touched the edge of the wet patch with a pen. The pen's tip faded instantly, leaving a white trail. His voice grew cold as he asked Martin to explain. Martin's face tightened. He insisted the water sample must have been contaminated by accident. He attempted to speak with his earlier confidence, but his words came too fast, the calm rhythm broken. Luke spoke slowly, stating that Max had recognized the smell before the jar spilled. He explained that industrial treatment water could contain chemicals used in cleaning and sterilizing pipes. Water from a natural supply would never bleach wood or corrode metal. Commissioner Harris requested an immediate independent test. A technician arrived to collect the remaining liquid. Max sat near Luke, his eyes still locked on the jar, as though guarding the truth itself. While they waited for results, silence filled the room. Martin tapped his foot softly, a small slip in his composed demeanor. Walter looked down at his hands, whispering, quietly, that he was afraid to hope. Luke leaned close and told him to stay steady. He said that once the truth started to rise, it did not go back into hiding. The test results arrived quickly. The water contained industrial chemicals, including agents used for machinery cleaning. Not a trace of natural mineral content existed in the sample. This was not water from a shared supply line. It was processed industrial water. Commissioner Harris looked at Martin for a long moment. The room held its breath. He then announced that the evidence provided by the company was invalid. He stated that the act of presenting a contaminated sample raised serious questions regarding further misconduct. He reviewed the reports of the severed pipe and concluded that the orchard's water line had been deliberately damaged. Until the investigation was complete, the county would restore temporary water rights to Walter's land. Walter's shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in overwhelming relief. Tears slid down the corners of his eyes, though he tried to hide them behind the brim of his cap. Luke rested a hand on the old man's shoulder, feeling both his exhaustion and his gratitude. Max wagged his tail slowly, sensing the shift in emotion. Martin gathered his papers with stiff movements and left the room without meeting anyone's eyes. His departure felt like a door closing on years of buried truth. Outside the courthouse, the sky finally began to clear. A thin beam of sunlight broke through the clouds, falling across the courthouse steps. Luke felt the air lighten slightly, as though Orchard Creek itself released a long-held breath. He looked down at Max, who stood proudly at his side. The dog had once again sensed what no one else could. Luke whispered, "Good job," and Max pressed his head gently against Luke's hand. The first step had been won, but Luke knew the fight ahead was not over. The morning sun rose gently over Orchard Creek, casting a warm golden sheen across the valley. The sky held a soft blue color, and a thin breeze carried the faint scent of soil waking after a long rest. Dew clung to every leaf, making the orchard appear as though it had been dusted with tiny droplets of light. The air promised a day of steady work and quiet hope. Luke Miller stepped into the orchard with Max at his side. Luke felt the weight of the last few months still pressing on him, but it blended now with a new sense of purpose. His broad shoulders and weathered face showed the signs of long labor, yet there was a calmness in his eyes that had not existed before. His hands carried both strength and gentleness, shaped by years of hard service and harder rebuilding. Walter arrived shortly after, moving slowly with his thin frame, but showing more energy than he had in recent weeks. His gray hair stuck out beneath his cap, and his lined face brightened when he saw the running water trickling through the old channels. He held a small wooden tool used for clearing debris, and although his movements remained cautious, his spirit did not feel defeated anymore. The orchard was breathing again, and Walter breathed with it. Grace walked up the path, carrying a canvas tote filled with notes and small flags. She wore a green sweater and comfortable jeans, with her silver-threaded hair tied loosely at the back. Her calm, determined expression made her appear like the quiet center, holding the entire operation steady. Grace had a way of speaking softly, but conveying certainty. When she greeted Luke, her voice carried a warmth that encouraged him to keep going. The townspeople arrived in small groups, some carrying shovels, others bringing buckets and spare tools. These were men and women who lived simple, honest lives. Many had known Walter for decades and had watched the orchard decline year after year with sadness. Now they returned to help restore what had once been a symbol of pride for the town. Their faces bore the tired but hopeful expressions of people who understood the meaning of community. Max darted through the rows, tail-high nose close to the ground, tracking the flow of water like a guardian. His thick coat shone in the morning light, and his eyes moved with sharp focus. Every time a new section of the channel opened, Max ran beside it, as though measuring its strength. Luke watched him with a fondness that tightened his chest. Max had always seemed to understand things deeper than sight and sound. Now the dog looked as if he sensed the orchard's heartbeat returning. Work continued throughout the day. Luke knelt often, clearing mud from the old stones, adjusting the direction of the water, and using his steady hands to secure cracked wooden frames. His mind returned briefly to his years as a soldier when he built paths through damaged towns, helping civilians regain what had once been theirs. This orchard felt similar, though quieter. Each task gave him purpose. Each small change reminded him that he could still help rebuild lives. Walter moved along the rows, using his small tool to break apart clumps of dry soil. Though his body tired quickly, he refused to rest longer than a few minutes. This land had been his family's heart for generations, and he felt a responsibility to answer its call now that the water returned. Every time a young shoot poked through the dirt, his eyes softened, and he would whisper a quiet thank you under his breath. Grace coordinated the work marking sections that needed reinforcement and documenting the revival of the orchard. She carried an old notebook where she recorded observations about the water flow and the health of the trees. Her handwriting moved neatly across the page, keeping order in what could have been chaos. She occasionally paused to look across the orchard, her expression showing a mixture of nostalgia and newfound optimism. Weeks passed. The orchard transformed slowly from brittle silence into a place humming with life. Buds emerged at the ends of dry branches. Leaves unfurled in a soft pale green. The scent of soil changed from dust to something sweet and hopeful. Luke felt the change deep inside him each time he stepped onto the land. Restoring the orchard felt like restoring a piece of himself. Max continued his steady patrols, running daily along the channels. Sometimes he stopped to listen, ears perked, tail still. In those moments, Luke imagined the dog could hear the water speak. It made him smile even on the hardest days. By the end of the season, the first apples appeared. They were small, not yet perfect, but bright spots of red and gold clinging to the branches. Walter stood beneath one of the trees, staring at the fruit, with tears sliding quietly down his face. Luke placed a supportive hand on his shoulder. Walter nodded, without speaking, overwhelmed by the orchard's return from the brink. With the orchard reborn, the town decided to hold a small celebration. It would be the first festival in years. Tables were carried to the old barn. Bunting was hung between posts. Children played along the fence, running with laughter that made the orchard feel even more alive. Grace supervised the setup, placing signs that read, "Orchard Creek Reserve." Luke and Walter carried crates of the first bottled apple cider to the main table. The bottles were simple but sturdy, with clean labels carrying the orchard's name. When Luke set the first crate down, he felt a sense of pride that ran deep. It was not pride in himself, but in what everyone had accomplished together. The townspeople gathered, tasting the cider and sharing stories about the old days. Laughter rose into the warm air. Music played lightly from a portable speaker someone brought. The valley glowed with golden afternoon light. Then an unexpected visitor arrived. A well-known television chef named Aaron Blake, who had been traveling through the region, stopped at the festival. Aaron Blake was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with sun-browned skin and a thick beard trimmed neatly. His deep brown eyes carried a lively curiosity. He had built a reputation for highlighting small-town foods and had a warm, booming voice that carried easily across crowds. When he tasted the first spoonful of cider syrup, he paused, letting the flavor settle on his tongue. The festival quieted. Then Aaron broke into a wide, approving smile. His voice rang out rich and enthusiastic. He said that the cider tasted like the memory of an honest town, and that the orchard carried a soul people would want to return to. The reaction was immediate. Applause rose. People cheered. Aaron Blake placed several orders on the spot and promised to feature the orchard on his travel show. The news spread quickly through the festival, filling the air with renewed excitement. Luke watched Walter as the old man took in the moment. Walter looked humbled, almost disbelieving. His thin frame trembled slightly, and his eyes glistened with emotion. Luke felt a tight ache in his chest. Walter had fought against despair for so long. Now he stood in the center of a celebration he had once believed would never happen again. Max lay near Luke's feet, tail sweeping slowly across the ground as though content with the world at last. Luke rested a hand on the dog's head, absorbing the warmth beneath his palm. He felt a quiet sense of victory. Not a battle won by force, but by steady hands, hard work, and the determination of people who refused to abandon hope. As the sun sank behind the hills, casting long shadows across the orchard, the festival lights began to glow softly. Music drifted again, and children danced near the tables. Luke realized that Orchard Creek had changed. The orchard was alive. The people were alive. He himself felt alive in a way he had not felt in years. This was not the end of their struggle, but it was the first true sign that the land and its people could rise again. A soft dawn stretched across Orchard Creek, with pale gold light settling over the hills. The sky was clear and quiet, holding a stillness that made the orchard appear timeless. A cool breeze brushed lightly through the branches, carrying the faint scent of fresh apples and damp soil. It was the kind of morning that felt gentle from the first breath. Luke Miller stepped onto the porch, holding a warm mug of tea between his hands. His face had grown calmer over the past months. The deep lines around his eyes had softened, though they still carried the history of old battles and long nights. The shadows of hardship remained, but there was a steadiness in his posture, now a quiet acceptance of belonging. Max lay at his feet, with his thick coat rising and falling in an easy rhythm. The dog lifted his head when Luke moved, ears flicking, as though already listening for the orchard's pulse. Walter walked slowly from the far side of the farmhouse. His steps had become shorter and his breath lighter. His body had grown frail, but his spirit never lost the pride of a man who had cared for the land his whole life. His thin frame swayed slightly in the breeze, and his white hair fluffed around his face like soft frost. The lines on his cheeks deepened when he smiled at Luke and Max. Luke watched him carefully, absorbing every small movement. He had grown protective of Walter, not out of duty, but out of deep respect. Walter had carried the weight of the orchard for too many years alone. Now, Luke wanted to ease that weight, even if only with small acts of daily care. The news from the county had arrived earlier that week. The Beverage Corporation had been found liable for illegal dumping and falsified reports. Investigators had traced waste barrels and chemical runoff directly to restricted industrial sites. They were ordered to pay restitution and withdraw their operations from the region. The company's departure felt like a long exhale for Orchard Creek, and the people walked through town with lighter steps. Still, Luke felt a lingering ache inside him. He had spent many years drifting after returning from war, never knowing where he truly belonged. Though he had helped Walter restore the orchard, he sometimes wondered if he deserved this new peace. Max nudged his leg, as though sensing the thought. Luke placed a hand on the dog's head, steadying himself. Walter approached the porch holding a small folder tied with a thin, faded ribbon. His hands trembled as he extended it toward Luke. His voice came as a soft rasp, shaped by age and gratitude. "Luke, I need you to take this." Luke frowned, gently unsure. Walter nodded, insisting without force, only sincerity. When Luke opened the folder, he found a notarized will, neatly written in clear, careful handwriting. Walter explained slowly. His voice wavered, but carried conviction. He said that the land needed someone who listened to the earth, not someone who saw it only as profit. He said that Luke had become the caretaker the orchard had waited for. In the document, the orchard was transferred fully to Luke with the simple description, the man who tended the soil and understood the water. Luke felt his breath tighten. The weight of the moment pressed into him deeper than any medal or recognition he had ever received. He had spent years searching for purpose after returning home. He never expected to find it here among quiet rows of apple trees. Luke began to protest, but Walter lifted a thin hand. His eyes shone with a warmth that silenced Luke. Walter said he had lived a long life, and not always a brave one. He said Luke had given the orchard hope again, and hope was worth protecting. Grace arrived shortly after walking up the path with her green cardigan fluttering gently in the wind. Her silver-threaded hair caught the morning light, and her steady steps carried a familiar strength. She greeted them with a smile that brightened the somber moment. Grace explained that the town council had agreed to support the orchard as a community cooperative. Her calm voice outlined plans for shared labor, small business partnerships, and educational programs for local families. She had organized everything with clear understanding of what the land meant to the community. Luke listened with quiet gratitude. Grace had been a pillar in the revival of Orchard Creek. She always carried herself with a calm dignity and with a thoughtful kindness that softened even the hardest tasks. Luke admired her ability to stand strong without ever raising her voice. Max trotted down the steps and began his daily patrol along the water channels. His paws left small prints in the dew as he moved with purpose. He paused often, lowering his head to listen to the ground. Luke watched him, feeling a sense of awe. Max was more than a working dog. He was a presence, a steady spirit, guiding the orchard through every step of its recovery. Children from town often greeted Max during their visits. They followed him along the paths as though he were a gentle guardian. Max never barked at them. Instead, he allowed them to walk beside him with soft patience. Many people began calling him the heart of Orchard Creek. The name fit him well. Luke spent his days repairing fences, tending seedlings, clearing debris, and learning the small, quiet rhythms that defined the orchard. At night, he sat on the porch, listening to the steady trickle of water returning to the channels. Every sound grounded him in a way he had never known. For the first time since leaving the military, he no longer felt like a man untethered. Walter rested often now, sleeping long hours in his small room. On afternoons, when he felt stronger, he sat near the barn, watching Luke work. The pride in his gaze was unmistakable. Luke felt the emotion each time, sensing the connection between them had deepened into something close to family. One evening, as the sun lowered into a soft wash of orange and pink, Luke walked through the orchard with Max trotting quietly beside him. The trees swayed gently, their branches whispering in the wind. The air tasted sweet with the promise of a future shaped by care, not fear. Luke stopped at the far ridge where he could see the entire orchard spread beneath him. He felt the weight of his past rise and soften. He had lost many things in life: friends, stability, a sense of direction. But here in this quiet valley, he had found something he never expected: a home, a purpose, a family. Max pressed against his leg, warm, steady, grounding him once more. Luke lowered a hand to stroke the dog's thick coat. He whispered a quiet thank you meant for the orchard, for Walter, for Grace, for Max, for the chance to begin again. When Luke returned to the farmhouse, lights glowed warmly through the windows. The scent of apple bread drifted from the kitchen. Grace was setting the table, while Walter rested nearby, wrapped in a soft blanket. Luke felt something settle into place inside him, a peace long delayed, but finally found. The orchard would continue. The cooperative would grow. Walter's legacy would remain. Max would lead the morning walks, guiding the flow of life along the water channels. And Luke would stay, no longer a wandering soldier, but a man with roots. The chapter of hardship had closed. A new chapter built on belonging had begun. The story of Orchard Creek reminds us that hope often begins in quiet places. A broken orchard found new life through the hands of a veteran searching for purpose, an old man longing for redemption, a librarian who refused to forget the truth, and a loyal dog who listened to the heartbeat of the land. Together, they showed that communities grow stronger when people choose compassion over fear and courage over silence. Their journey teaches us that even after years of loss renewal is possible when we stand together. In our own lives, miracles rarely appear with thunder. They come slowly through kindness shared work and the steady grace that God places in our path. As you finish this story, may you feel encouraged to listen for the small blessings around you and to believe that restoration can find any heart willing to receive it. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and join our community by subscribing. May God bless you, protect your home, and guide your steps with quiet miracles each day.